Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast, a place where you can keep informed of the latest business and tech trends by listening to stories of other people in your field and how they are overcoming challenges with emerging technologies. Join me in learning from the guests actionable tips and lessons learned to obtain greater clarity on how you or your business can leverage technology. And today I'm excited to be speaking with Haggai Polak from a company called Skybox Security, who is known for his passion for creating and executing product plans to match business value. And I've invited him on the podcast today to talk about his story as usual, but more than anything, I want to dedicate today's episode to continuous threat exposure management, which was a new term introduced by Gartner this year. And in a recent report, Gartner mentioned that enterprises fail at reducing their exposure to threats through self-assessment of risks because of unrealistic, siloed and tool-centric approaches, and security and risk management leaders must initiate and mature a continuous threat exposure management to stay ahead of the threats. And Gartner go on to say that continued threat exposure management is a set of processes and capabilities that allow enterprises to continually and consistently evaluate the accessibility, exposure and exploitability of an enterprise's digital and physical assets. But what does that actually mean? Well, that's why I've invited today's guest on the podcast. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the US, where he's waiting to share his story with me today. And also, hopefully we'll make it much easier for everybody listening to completely understand what continuous threat exposure management is and what they can do about it. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, my name is Haggai Polak. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Skybox Security. Been with the company for 2 years. And what I do is essentially run the product management team and oversee the company and product strategy and roadmap execution.
And a question I always like to ask my guests is take you back before Skybox Security and what you're doing now and learn more about your origin story, what put you on this path and where you first got interested in technology. Are there any specific moments in your life that you can trace that back to?
Well, I would say going back to ancient history that I had a strong dislike for physics, and the alternative to do a lot of units of physics in high school was computer science. I said, yeah, I could do that. That should be easy. And that's kind of how I got into computer science back in the old days of PDP computers and mainframes. Then made my escape from mainframes as soon as I could to Novell networks and server farms and Unix and Windows NT, and the rest is history. But I found myself very quickly liking the business side of technology and kind of made the switch into product management and really been doing product management in networking and then network security for the past 20 plus years.
Love it. And of course, that path would eventually lead you to Skybox Security. And I'm conscious there might be a few people hearing about that for the very first time. So you could just tell me a little bit more about the company and also the problems that you're solving with technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So the company has been around for a while, and we really are active in two key markets. We sell solutions to some of the largest, most complex organizations on the planet. And we help them in two areas. The first one is what we call security posture management, which is really the ability to go look at your infrastructure, look at the configurations, look at how things are set up, and making sure that your security infrastructure and your network infrastructure is actually doing what it's supposed to do. You know, we all make these huge investments in security tools and firewalls and intrusion detection products, but we don't really know if they do what they're supposed to, if they're configured correctly, if there are any gaps, any maybe human errors, maybe issues with the products or their software themselves. And we help with the kind of overarching assurance of all of that by mapping your network, creating the configuration, checking the software that's running on all of these different devices and components, and making sure that your posture is where it needs to be, whether it's posture compared against industry benchmarks or various types of regulations, or just your own internal preferences in terms of where you want your connectivity access posture to be. We're also very active in the vulnerability management space, and specifically, we do what's typically called risk-based vulnerability management or vulnerability prioritization. And this is about, again, looking at all of these potential exposures around your infrastructure, not just network devices and security devices, but also servers and laptops and endpoints, and helping everybody kind of make sense with all the noise that's coming from looking at vulnerabilities on these devices. Some of our customers have had millions of vulnerabilities detected across their infrastructure with their scanners. But that's not very actionable, right? They need to know how to prioritize and how to address and remediate, and what's more critical and more urgent than others. But I'm sure we'll get more into that in the rest of the conversation.
We really will. And one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast was after reading in the summer that a new term was introduced by Gartner, and that is continuous threat exposure management. And I'd love to find out a little bit more about that. So what would you say the main objective of it is? And is anything around that you can expand on?
Yeah, and I think the name suggests a lot. It's a departure from several of techniques or programs that used to be employed in the past. And the departure is, first of all, in the continuous aspect, recognizing that just running a scan or bringing in some kind of an agency to do some testing for you twice a year is not enough, because new vulnerabilities are introduced all the time. We know that CV databases grow at rates of 10,000s a year. And your infrastructure is changing all the time. So you really need the ability to do this threat assessment or exposure management on a more continuous basis. And we typically recommend customers run daily, some even on some areas of their network, do hourly scans to see what changed, both in terms of their infrastructure and its configuration, as well as new threats or new exploits to threats that have become available to malicious actors. So continuous would be one big departure from the way vulnerability management used to be done. And then the other change I would point to is the fact that we're now using the term exposure as opposed to just vulnerabilities. And this is also an expansion of the scope of the original vulnerability management solutions or programs that were really focused on just vulnerabilities, i.e., something is potentially compromised on a specific piece of software, hardware, and somebody could go and exploit. Exposure is much wider than that, right? A misconfiguration could be an exposure. A missing control gap could be an exposure. So it's not necessarily that there's a software bug or something is broken. Maybe something just made a human error. Somebody just made an error and misconfigured something and allowed access to an area of the network that they shouldn't, and that's an exposure. So these are really kind of more mature ways to manage cyber risk across the enterprise.
And if we look back in the last 2 years, the whole workplace has transformed from most people working inside an office to remote working at scale. Then we've evolved into hybrid working. And beyond that, there's the rise of digital nomads, where ultimately people expect to work from any device, any network, any country at any time. So as you said, it's no longer enough, the old way and the old approaches to security. But what do you think continuous threat exposure management will ultimately mean for the traditional enterprise security?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that we see a change in focus areas of infrastructure that customers want to secure. If in the past we've seen a lot of focus on connecting and securing the brick and mortar branch offices. Obviously, in the last 2 years, there's more and more questions about how do you secure these remote users? How do you make sure before they connect into critical assets that their laptops are indeed have the right posture, the right software, the right configuration before you let them in. So I would say the kind of target areas of infrastructure have slightly changed because of remote working, but the techniques and the tools and the methods are pretty much the same.
And how are you at Skybox Security? How are you approaching this and ultimately helping organizations better understand how exposure management can help them stay ahead of today's cybersecurity threats? Because we're reading almost every day, there's this constant increasing attacks. The threat landscape is continuously evolving as well. So how are you helping your customers with this?
Yeah, so when we look at the definition of exposure management programs, we typically see a few kind of very distinct stages or areas in the program. And we try to do our best to provide a rich tool set to our customers to really check all the boxes in each one of those 4 areas. And with your permission, I'll quickly enumerate them.
Sure.
The first one is discovery, right? Exposure management starts with understanding what you have in great amount of detail. So what kind of assets do you have? What's the bill of material of software installed on those assets? Who do they belong to? What is their business criticality? And all of these different attributes that we need in order to kind of model the infrastructure and understand what we have and what's its importance. The next part is detecting the exposures, and that's where we integrate with various scanners, not only in the IT world, but also the OT world, and start understanding, mapping the various exposures that exist on these different assets. And again, these are not necessarily just CVEs or vulnerabilities. These could be misconfigurations, missing controls, missing tools that should be installed on those assets but are not. All of these constitute as exposures. So once we're done with that second stage, now we typically have a list of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of potential exposures in our infrastructure. And now we need to start sorting that out. Companies that rely on CVE scores or CVSS typically run into issue where there's just too many critical vulnerabilities or critical issues, and they don't know where to start, right? They have a limited remediation bandwidth, and they need to focus their effort on the risks that are really the biggest to them. And that's where we help customers manage that, where they can essentially configure and tell us what's important to them. We bring in a lot of external threat intel to figure out which of these vulnerabilities or exposures are actually being exploited in the wild. We also help them connect that to business language with cyber risk quantification. That's an emerging trend that we can talk more about if you'd like, where you really are now able to create a common language between the technical security people and the business people and quantify cyber risk in monetary terms or availability terms or any kind of metrics that the business people can easily understand. And now finally, after we know what are the top exposures to remediate, we can move to the final step, which is remediation and verification. And that's where you try to kick off and automate as much of this remediation as possible, but also verify that remediation was indeed effective and measure various metrics around the program. For example, did you meet your remediation SLAs for various types of exposures?
One of the trends that really interests me is all the conversations that you're having with different clients from different companies in multiple industries. Are there any trends around the kind of concerns and questions that they're asking you about when it comes to continuous threat exposure management? Because as we said, it's a relatively new label that's been put on this, and there's going to be a lot of business leaders rushing around trying to make sense of it and looking for help. What kind of questions, and are there any trends in those questions that people are asking you?
Yeah, I would point out to three. The first one we mentioned, which is quantification, and this is really where the security people are asking for our help to translate cyber risk into a business language. So, for example, if there's a big risk on a small number of servers, but these servers are extremely critical and to the organization, and any downtime on those servers translate into huge monetary losses, that's something our customers want help calculating and showcasing, so they can show why they're prioritizing remediation and additional security tools on that small group of servers. The second one would be around automation. We all know about cybersecurity personnel shortages. So a big trend would be to help customers do as much of this vulnerability management lifecycle as automatically or autonomously as possible. And this is a trend we've been seeing in IT in general with no-code automation and other techniques and programs, and in security as well. And I think in some ways, SOARs, security orchestration automation systems, have let customers down because they were not smart enough to do automation safely with a lot of context. But customers are not giving up, and they're still looking for ways to remediate quicker with less human involvement, less human errors, and really respond quickly to high severity threats in the environment. And then the last one, and you kind of touched on it earlier, is the expansion from just traditional legacy IT and doing exposure and threat management on somewhat neglected parts of your infrastructure, like your operational technology equipment. And this is also where we see customers asking for the application of vulnerability threat management on their OT, obviously on their cloud workloads, in some cases for their remote workers. And it's no longer enough to just do vulnerability management on the servers in the data center or on the devices that are in the building.
And what about yourselves at Skybox? What's next for you? What's going to be your big focus in the new year?
Well, I kind of spilled the beans here because we are obviously continuing our investment in exactly these areas. We are doing more integrations. We've launched some successful integrations with OT security companies, and we'll continue to double down on this as we see demand ticking up with critical infrastructure, energy companies, manufacturing companies. We're adding a lot more automation capabilities, again, with integration with companies like Avanti, where we would help customers kick off that patching process, integrations with ServiceNow to make sure we work well with their ITSMs to manage the ticket lifecycle for remediation and vulnerabilities. And obviously, our continued investment in cloud infrastructure. We have great support for Azure and AWS. We added support for GCP as well last year. And we're going to continue and enhance our integrations to make sure we can provide all of these capabilities and services to whatever technology and tech stack the customer is adopting. One that has been in great demand is microsegmentation in the data center. That's been picking up, especially with our financial customers. And again, we're doing some great integrations and announcements there to make sure that you can manage microsegmentation in the data center, just like you used to manage and control your legacy firewalls.
Well, thank you so much for sparing a little time to sit down with me and share your valuable insights today. I appreciate behind the scenes. It's been a bit of a crazy day. You are on the road. You've been trying to find somewhere quiet to talk with me. But before I let you go, I want to ask you to leave us with one other thing. And that is, Is there a book that you would recommend to everybody listening that we can add to our Amazon wish list? I always like to ask my guests if there's something they would recommend and other people can check out. So what book would you recommend? And is there a story or reason behind that recommendation?
That's an easy one. So by far my favorite book that I read, or I should say listen to, since I don't have time to read that much, but I'm an avid Audible user. And I actually listened to it 3 times in the last year, which is an indication of how good I thought it was. And that's Project Hail Mary. And Project Hail Mary is the 3rd book of, I hope I'm pronouncing and remember his name correctly, Andy Weir, which most people would know from his first book, which is The Martian. And I don't know if you know, but he's actually a tech worker. I think he worked for HP for many years, Bay Area native that just kind of dabbled in writing a book and had tremendous success self-publishing The Martian and Amazon. His second book, Artemis, I thought was okay, but his 3rd book that came out last year, Project Hail Mary, is just perfect. It's so good. So absolutely recommend that.
Awesome. I will definitely be checking that out. And like yourself, I don't have time, or at least that's what I keep telling myself. I don't have time to sit down and read a book. There's always something else that comes up. But Audible has saved my life in so many ways. If I'm walking my dog or doing something, I can just soak up a good book in ways I couldn't do before. So I'll be checking that out. And for anyone listening that would just like to find out more information about Skybox Security, any of the topics we explored today, in particular, continuous threat exposure management, what's the best starting point for everything?
Yeah, so definitely our website, where we have some good information, resources, webinars, and the ability to request a demo. And obviously we are global, so we can get to you wherever you need us to, typically in whatever language you need us to. And then personally, I'm on LinkedIn and always happy to accept messages and invitations.
Fantastic. Well, as I said at the very beginning of the podcast, Gartner only recently announced continuous threat exposure management. There's so much talk about it at the moment, and I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to come on here, demystifying it, talking about it in a language everyone can understand, and also the best way forward, and also sharing your great story and leaving us with a great book too. So thank you so much for sitting down and sharing that with me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, there you have it. Hopefully, you now know everything you needed to know about continuous threat exposure management, or at least enough to dig a little bit deeper and understand how it could impact your enterprise. And what does continuous threat exposure management mean to you? What are you doing to prepare in 2023 for that evolving threat landscape, so in protecting your enterprise on that evolving threat landscape? Whatever it is, please let me know. techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC.Hughes. Now, one of the most common emails I get from listeners is businesses struggling to monitor a growing number of communications from their customers. Because as customers, we expect to be able to call, text, and email a service provider or company or whoever. And when we enter the workplace, we have even more communication methods, which means we are all constantly switching between multiple apps to get the full conversation. But it doesn't have to be this way. And I want to give a shout out today to a guest you may recall from, I think it was episode 1875, where I had a great conversation with Thomas Gorney, the co-founder and CEO of Nextiva. He had a great startup story, which is truly inspirational, and I urge you to check that out. But the reason I mention him is because at Nextiva, they bring customer and team conversations all together in a single screen. So essentially, with Nextiva, you call, text, chat, video meet, and just about everything you can imagine in that one window, that one app. And the real special thing is that you get to see the entire conversation history into a single thread, and you're not having to switch between all those multiple apps. So now, if a customer contacts you, you'll know their whole story, and you can engage with the customer or your team inside a single app. So if you're interested in having one app to manage your customer and your team conversations, simply visit nextiva.com/techtalkdaily. We'll keep this conversation going, but more than anything, a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.